3 times the backyard turned into hell. The enigma of the keys. Those were the words scrawled on a piece of notebook paper that Marcus Bellamy found folded inside an old coffee tin buried beneath the back porch of the house he had just inherited. 3 times the backyard turned into hell. He read it twice, standing in the cold October wind, his fingers going numb against the worn edges of the paper. And the chill he felt had nothing to do with the weather. The words were written in his father's handwriting. Marcus was 34 years old, had not spoken. Hai monge Bellamy Nelavias. Not since the night Raymond had loaded 3 boxes into his truck, backed out of the driveway of their family home in Millhaven, Indiana, and never come back. No calls, no letters, no explanation that ever satisfied anyone. Just gone, the way certain kinds of silence go, completely, deliberately, without mercy. And then, 8 weeks ago, a lawyer named Gerald Pruitt had called Marcus at his apartment in Columbus to inform him that Raymond Bellamy had passed away alone in the same Millhaven house where Marcus had grown up, and that he had left the property to his only son. Marcus had driven the 3 hours from Columbus to Millhaven on a gray Tuesday morning, telling himself it was just paperwork, just property, just a house that needed to be emptied, assessed, and either sold or signed over to someone else. He had told his wife, Dana, that he would be back by Thursday at the latest. He had kissed his daughter Lily on the top of her head, breathed in the familiar smell of her shampoo, and gotten into his car with the intention of feeling nothing. That was 6 days ago. Now, he stood in the backyard of the house, at the end of Correll Lane, holding a piece of paper that made his hands shake. And the afternoon sky was pressing down on him like something with weight. The backyard was large, almost an acre of land that backed up against a dense thicket of oak and elm trees. The kind of Midwestern tree line that looks perfectly ordinary in daylight and becomes something else entirely when the light runs out. The grass was long and dead in patches, and the old wooden fence that separated the yard from the neighboring property on the left had collapsed in 2 places, its boards rotting into the soil. There was a fire pit near the back, a circle of blackened stones that Marcus did not remember being there when he was a child, and there was the smell. A deep, persistent smell of damp earth, and something older that he could not name, rising up from the ground itself, as though the yard was exhaling. He had found the coffee tin by accident. He had been walking the perimeter of the porch, checking for structural damage, as the realtor had suggested, when his foot had gone through a soft patch of ground near the northeast corner. He had crouched down to look and found the boards there were loose, 3 of them set apart from the rest in a way that suggested they had been removed and replaced many times. Underneath was a shallow depression in the dirt, no deeper than 6 inches, and sitting in the center of it was the tin, red and white, a brand of coffee that had not been sold since the early 1990s. And inside the tin, wrapped in a plastic bag, were 3 things: the note, a small brass key on a worn leather cord, and a photograph. The photograph showed the backyard. This backyard. But the image was old, developed on the kind of matte paper that photographers used in the 1980s, and in the photograph, the backyard looked different. There was no fire pit, there was no collapsed fence. There was a large, wooden structure near the back tree line that Marcus had never seen before. Something between a shed and a hutch, its shape half obscured by shadow. And standing in the yard, with his back to the camera, was a man whose build and posture Marcus recognized immediately as his father's. Younger by perhaps 20 years, and the man was holding something long and wrapped in cloth. Marcus stood in that same spot for a long time. The house behind him creaked. A sound like settling, like old wood contracting against the cold, but it came from the wrong direction. From the side of the house that faced the tree line, and it came again after a moment of silence. Rhythmic and purposeful, the way a sound is when something is making it on purpose. He went inside. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what happens in the days that follow is the kind of story that gets harder to look away from with every passing minute. And you do not want to miss a single moment of what Marcus finds inside that house. The inside of the house had been lived in until recently, which was the part that unsettled Marcus most. He had expected abandonment, layers of dust, empty rooms, the hollow feeling of a space that has been vacant for years. Instead, the house was almost exactly as he remembered it from his childhood, with the addition of 11 years of his father's solitary life layered over the top of it like sediment. There were dishes in the drying rack, a jacket hanging by the front door, a half-completed crossword puzzle on the kitchen table with a pencil resting diagonally across it, as though Raymond had simply stepped away to use the bathroom and would be back in a moment. Gerald Pruitt had told Marcus that Raymond had passed in his sleep. Natural causes. A neighbor named Rosalie Dent, who lived in the yellow house 3 doors down, had not seen the lights go on for 3 mornings in a row and had finally called the county. Marcus had asked the lawyer what condition the house was in when they found it, and the lawyer had paused in a way that suggested he was choosing his words carefully before saying that it was undisturbed. Marcus had assumed that meant clean, neat. He was beginning to understand that it might have meant something else. The key from the tin was on the kitchen counter now, next to the photograph and the note. Marcus had been in the house for 4 days already, going through his father's belongings in the methodical way that grief sometimes disguises itself as practicality. And he had found no lock that the small brass key fit. He had tried every door, every cabinet, every drawer that had a mechanism for a key. He had gone through the basement, which was unfinished and smelled of must and old motor oil, and found no cabinet, no box, no chest, nothing. He had searched the garage. He had searched the hallway closet that still held his own childhood winter coats on the bottom rod, unwashed and untouched, as though Raymond had been unable or unwilling to remove them. On the second day, Marcus had called Dana and told her he needed a few more days. She had asked him if he was all right, and he had said yes in the voice he used, when the answer was something more complicated. On the third day, he had called Dana again, and this time she had not said much, just listened and then said his name once, in the tone that meant she was worried about him. On the 4th day, he had found the note in the tin and had not called Dana at all. The nachisage the rig barhel. The note was in his father's handwriting, but his father had been a man of almost no written words. Marcus could count on one hand the times he had seen Raymond write anything longer than a grocery list. The phrasing of the note was strange. It was not explanatory. It was not apologetic. It was not addressed to anyone. It read less like a message left for someone to find and more like a line from something larger. A fragment, the middle of a sentence that had started somewhere else. That evening, Marcus went to see Rosalie Dent. She was in her mid-70s, a small, tidy woman with silver hair cut short and a directness in her eyes that Marcus found immediately reassuring. She invited him in without hesitation, as though she had been expecting him, and set a mug of coffee in front of him before he had finished sitting down. She said, "You found something, didn't you?" It was not a question. Marcus placed the photograph on her kitchen table. He watched her face. Rosalie Dent looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Then she said that structure in the back. "Your father called it the Cold House. He built it in 1987. He took it down in 1994. I never knew why." Marcus asked her what it was for. She said she did not know. She said that Raymond had not been a man who explained himself, which was something Marcus knew in his bones. She said that for a period of about 3 years, in the late 80s, there had been unusual activity in and around the Bellamy property. She used the word unusual in the way that people in small Midwestern towns use it, carefully, without elaboration, as though precision might summon something. She said that there had been lights in the backyard at night that she could see from her bedroom window, not electric lights. lantern light or candle light, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. She said that there had been sounds on certain nights, low sounds that she had assumed at first were an animal. And she said that twice in the space of those 3 years. Police had come to the Bellamy property on Corell Lane, once in the summer of 1988 and once in the fall of 1990. Marcus asked her what had happened those 2 times. Rosalie wrapped her hands around her own coffee mug and looked at him with the expression of a woman deciding how much to give and how much to keep. Then she said, both times, something was found in the yard, and both times, your father said he had no explanation for it. And both times, the police went away without doing anything further. This was Millhaven. People minded their own business. Marcus drove back to the house on Corell Lane in the dark. The road was the kind of country-adjacent road that Millhaven had plenty of 2 lanes. No streetlights after the intersection at Miller and 4th, bordered on both sides by property that was mostly residential but spread wide enough to feel rural. The fields on the left had been harvested weeks ago and the stalks were low and colorless under the headlights. He parked in the driveway and sat in his car for a moment before going in. The house was dark in the way houses get dark when they have been inhabited for a long time by someone who is no longer there. A specific kind of darkness that is different from empty dark, heavier, more present. Marcus had grown up in this house. He had sat at that kitchen table every morning for 18 years. He had run in and out of the back door 1,000 times. Cutting through the yard to the tree line where he and the neighborhood kids had built a path through the oaks. He had known every inch of this house, as the particular intimacy of childhood allows you to know a place. And standing in the kitchen now, with the note and the photograph and the key in front of him, he felt something loosen at the center of his understanding of his own history, the way the ground feels when the water table shifts. He thought about the cold house. He had no memory of it. He had been for years old in 1987. He had been 7 in 1990. Old enough to have remembered a structure in the backyard, old enough to have played near it. But there was nothing there in his memory, not even the absence of something, not even a gap where a shed or hut-shaped memory should have been. Just the backyard, as he had always known it, the fire pit that he now understood his father must have built after 1994. The Longitud Ras, Triline remembered. He went to bed at 11:30 and did not sleep. At 2:17 in the morning, he knew the time because he had looked at his phone minutes before it happened. Marcus heard a sound from the backyard. Not the creaking he had heard earlier, something more defined. A rhythmic metallic sound, like a tool working against resistance, and then a period of silence, and then the sound again. He lay still in the dark and listened to it for what he estimated was for minutes before he got up. He did not turn on the light. He went to the window of the back bedroom, the one that had been his parents' room and that he had been sleeping in because all the linens on his own childhood bed had long since gone stale, and he looked out at the backyard. There was no one there. The yard was empty and still under the half-moon. The fire pit was a circle of dark stones. The tree line was a wall of black. And yet the sound had been real. He was certain of that. Certain with the clarity that only comes from lying awake in the dark when the rest of the world is quiet. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the tree line. And then he saw it, a slight movement at the far edge of the yard, near where Rosalie had said the cold house had stood. Not a person, not an animal. Just the tall grass, moving against the wind in a pattern that did not match the direction the rest of the grass was moving. As though something had passed through it recently. As though something had just retreated into the trees. Marcus went back to bed and did not sleep for the remainder of the night. In the morning he called his wife. He told her he needed a week more. Dana said, "Marcus." He said, "I know." She said, "Call me tonight." He said, "I will." He did not tell her about the sound. He did not tell her about the grass. He went into the backyard just after dawn. when the light was flat and gray and the dew was still on everything, and he walked to the far edge of the yard near the tree line. The grass there was long, and he pushed through it carefully, looking at the ground. He found, in the dirt at the edge of the trees, 3 things that he stood looking at for a long time. A shallow rectangular depression in the earth, roughly 4 feet by 2 feet, with the edges defined to have been made by erosion or animal activity. Recent enough that the soil at the bottom was darker than the surrounding ground, meaning it had been exposed to air and the turning of something in the last few days. Beside it, half buried in the leaf debris at the base of the nearest oak, a second small brass key on a piece of rusted wire, identical in shape and size to the one he had found in the coffee tin, and on the bark of the oak tree itself, carved at roughly eye level in the same slow, deliberate way that people carve dates into wood to mark something permanent. Tumbers at 190 morning he looked at those numbers for a long time. He thought 1988 and 1990. The 2 years Rosalie had mentioned. The 2 times the police had come. He took the second key from the leaf debris and held it beside the first. They were not identical after all. One was slightly smaller, the tip worn down in a way that suggested heavy use. On the other, the one from was almost pristine, as though it had been made but never used. 2 keys, 2 years. 3 times the backyard turned into hell. The note said 3. The tree said 2. What was the third? If you are watching this, and something about this story has made you feel uneasy in a way you cannot fully explain, drop a comment below with the word keys so I know you are following this. Marcus spent that day going through his father's papers in the upstairs office, a narrow room at the back of the house that Raymond had always kept locked when Marcus was a child, and which Gerald Pruitt had opened for Marcus with a spare key during the initial walkthrough. The office was the one room in the house that felt different from the rest. No jacket on the door. No dishes drying. No crossword puzzle. It felt like a room that had been deliberately left empty of warmth. A functional room used for functional purposes. And the filing cabinet in the corner was locked with a mechanism that Marcus had been eyeing since the first day without trying either of the small brass keys on it, because the lock was clearly for a standard filing key, not something so small and ornate. But now he had 2 keys that came from the yard. He had 2 numbers carved into a tree. And he had a third thing that he had not told anyone about yet. A thing he had noticed on his 3rd day in the house and filed away without examining too closely. The way you sometimes notice something that your instinct tells you to let sit before you touch it. There was a 3rd key. He had found it on the 1st day, inside a ceramic dish on the kitchen windowsill, resting among pennies and guitar picks and the other small detritus of a life. He had placed it with the pennies and the guitar picks and thought nothing of it until the night he found the coffee tin, when something made him go back to the windowsill and look again. It was there, smaller than the others, made of a different metal that was darker and heavier. He had placed it on the counter next to the other 2. 3 keys. 3 times the backyard turned into hell. He spent the rest of the afternoon with the files from the cabinet, which he had opened with a standard filing key from Raymond's key ring. The filing cabinet keys were not the ornate brass ones, but ordinary keys, and the cabinet had opened easily. The files were what you would expect from a man who had lived quietly and alone for 11 years. Tax records. Utility bills, the deed to the house, medical paperwork from the last 2 years that told a story of slow physical decline without drama. But at the back of the bottom drawer, in a manila folder with nothing written on the tab, Marcus found a collection of documents that were different. The first was a handwritten inventory, for pages long, written in Raymond's tight, slanted script. It was a list of dates on descriptions. The earliest entry was August 14th, 1987. The most recent was November 3rd, 1993. Each entry included a date, a brief description that ranged from 1 word to 2 sentences, and a notation in the right margin that consisted of either a check mark or a small square. Some of the one-word descriptions were purely practical, words like trench, moved, covered, and others were more opaque. Words like decision, witnessed, and one that appeared 3 times, and made. Marcus set the paper down on his father's desk and pressed his palms flat against the surface to steady himself. The word was mistake. The second document in the folder was a handwritten letter, 3 pages, unaddressed and unsigned. It began with the sentence, "I am writing this because I do not trust my own memory to hold the shape of what happened correctly." And the rest of it was a careful, deliberate account of 3 separate incidents that had occurred in the backyard of the house on Corell Lane. Raymond Bellamy had written the letter in a voice that was utterly unlike the man Marcus had known or had believed he knew his entire life. The voice was not dramatic. It was not frightened. It was the voice of a man trying very hard to be accurate about something that accuracy alone could not fully explain. The first incident had occurred in the summer of 1988. Raymond had been working on an unspecified project near the tree line when he had discovered something underground that he had not anticipated. He described it in the letter as a space, deliberately made, no deeper than 3 feet, sealed with wooden boards that had been there for long enough that the wood had begun to deteriorate. Inside the space, he had found objects. He listed some of them: a glass jar containing folded papers, a metal box with no visible latch, a child's shoe, a bundle of cloth tied with twine. He had called the police and shown them the space. The police had come, examined the area, and concluded that the items were old, perhaps 30 years old by that point, perhaps more, and that there was no evidence of anything that fell within their jurisdiction. They had taken nothing away. They had made a report. And they had advised Raymond to fill in the space and move on. Raymond had filled in the space. He had not moved on. The second incident had occurred in the fall of 1990. By this point, Raymond had built and was regularly using the cold house as what Marcus now understood to be a kind of archive, a place where he stored the objects he had found and others that had turned up in subsequent months. During the work he had continued to do near the tree line, he had become, his letter made clear, something between an amateur historian and an obsessive, the kind of man who cannot find a mystery in his own backyard and simply leave it there. He had been cataloging. He had been researching. He had been quietly, methodically trying to understand what had happened on this piece of land before Raymond Bellamy owned it. In October of 1990, he had found something else. He did not describe what it was in the letter, at least not directly. He described his reaction to finding it, the long night he spent sitting on the back porch without going inside. The call he had made the next morning to the county records office. The second police visit that had resulted in nothing beyond a brief conversation and a second report filed and ignored. He described a conversation he had subsequently had with an older man, a man he referred to only as Harold, who had lived in Millhaven his entire life and who had told Raymond things about the history of the land on Corell Lane that Raymond said he wished he had never been told. Marcus turned the page. Harold had told Raymond that the land the house now sat on, before it was developed into residential lots in the late 1950s, had been part of a larger piece of property belonging to a family named Corell, the name the lane still carried. The Corell family had owned the land for 3 generations, and the last generation of them to actually live on it had been a man and his 2 sons who had vacated the property suddenly in 1962, leaving everything behind for reasons that Harold either could not or would not fully explain. Before they left, the eldest son had told a neighbor, Harold's father, it happened that there were things on that land that needed to stay buried. Not metaphorically. He had been specific. There were things on that land that needed to stay buried, and if anyone ever built on it, and if anyone ever dug too deep at the back near the trees, they would find them and they would have to make a choice. Raymond's letter did not say what the choice was. It moved, instead, to the third incident, which had occurred not in a single day but across a period of 3 weeks in the winter of 1993, and which Raymond described as the deciding event, the thing that had determined what he did next, the thing that had led, Marcus now understood, to the dismantling of the Cold House in 1994, to whatever had followed in the subsequent years, and ultimately to Raymond's departure from the house in a truck with 3 boxes in the bed, leaving his wife and his son behind without explanation. The third incident had begun when Raymond had opened the metal box with no visible latch. He had been trying to open it for 5 years. He had eventually found the mechanism. He wrote, almost by accident, a pressure point on the underside of the base that released a magnetic lock inside, and when it opened he had found inside it a set of documents. Old documents, on paper that had the brittleness of age, handwritten in a script that was formally structured and legible, and which described in careful detail a legal arrangement made in the spring of 1941 between the then owner of the Correll property and a party that the documents referred to only by initials, and which Marcus, reading his father's letter in the upstairs office on a cold October afternoon, could not fully identify from Raymond's description alone. What he could understand was this: the arrangement had involved the land. It had involved a series of transactions, some of them financial and some of them of a different nature, that Raymond's letter approached obliquely, in the manner of a man who has spent years thinking about how to describe something for which the ordinary language of transaction and exchange is insufficient. It had involved promises made and kept over a period of decades, and it had involved the storage, somewhere on the property, somewhere at the back near the trees, of something that the 1941 documents referred to only as the matter, and which was to remain undisturbed for a period of not less than 50 years from the date of the original arrangement. 50 years from 1941 was 1991. Raymond had found the box in 1988. He had opened it in 1993. And somewhere in the reading of those documents, in the winter of 1993, he had reached the conclusion that led him to do what he did next. Marcus put the letter down. He sat in his father's office for a long time with his hands in his lap and the 3 keys on the desk in front of him, and he tried to understand what he was holding. Not just the letter, not just the keys, but the shape of the thing that his father had lived with for all the years of Marcus's childhood and for the 11 years after. The weight of a thing found in your own backyard that does not have a name in the ordinary language of a life. The kind of thing you cannot unsee. The kind of thing that, once you understand it, changes the grammar of everything that came before it. He thought about a man standing in a yard at night with a lantern, moving slowly in the dark while his family slept. He thought about a child's shoe in a glass jar. He thought about the word mistake appearing 3 times in an inventory spanning 6 years. He thought about his father backing out of the driveway with 3 boxes and never looking back. He thought what was in those 3 boxes. Outside the window of the upstairs office, the backyard had gone dark. The oak trees at the back were a solid wall of black, and the fire pit was a circle of lighter darkness in the middle of the yard. And the rectangular depression in the earth near the tree line was invisible from this angle, but Marcus knew it was there. And he thought about the fact that whatever had made it had been made recently, within the last week, within the time he had been in the house. Someone had been in that yard while he was there. Someone had been digging. He went downstairs and checked the locks on the doors. Then he called Dana. She answered on the 2nd ring. He told her he had found some things. He told her about the letter. He told her about the keys. He told her about the rectangular depression in the earth near the tree line. He did not tell her in a frightened voice. He did not feel frightened, exactly, which was itself a strange thing to notice. He told her in the voice of someone reporting facts. the same voice his father had used in the letter. And when he was done, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to have meaning. Dana said, "Come home, Marcus," he said. "I can't yet." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I don't know what the third key opens." There was another silence. Then Dana said, "You know that you're describing exactly what your father did, don't you?" Marcus held the phone and looked at the keys on the kitchen counter. 3 of them different metals, different sizes, 2 from the yard and 1 from the dish on the windowsill. He looked at the photograph of his father standing in this same backyard decades ago, holding something wrapped in cloth. He looked at the note in his father's handwriting, the fragment of a sentence that was not a message, and not an explanation, and not an apology. 3 times the backyard turned into hell. He said, "I know." He did not leave. The next morning brought rain, steady and grey. And Marcus went to the county records office on Merchant Street in downtown Millhaven when it opened at 8. He had Raymond's letter with him, the relevant pages. And he asked the woman at the front desk, a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, named Diane, for property records related to the parcel at Correll Lane going back to 1940. Diane said that would take a little time and directed him to a waiting area with plastic chairs and a water cooler and a framed photograph of the Indiana state capitol on the wall. He waited 40 minutes. What Diane brought back to him was a manila envelope of photocopied documents, the deed history of the property, the plat records from the 1957 residential development of the Correll land, and, at Diane's quiet suggestion, a set of records from the county assessor's office showing the original Correll property boundaries before subdivision. She had also, without being asked, included a printout from the county historical archive, a document that she had flagged, with a yellow sticky note that said you might want to read this one. The document was a brief summary from a 1978 county historical survey, an amateur project that had been undertaken by a local historical society. The relevant section was 3 paragraphs describing the Correll family and their land. The Corrells had farmed the land from the early 1880s through the mid-20th century. The last resident, the man and his 2 adult sons, had vacated the property in the spring of 1960 under circumstances the survey described as unclear, but noting that the local sheriff's office had been involved in some capacity. Before the father's death in 1971, he had died in a care facility in a neighboring county, not in Millhaven. He had apparently made several attempts to contact the county about what the survey primly called a matter related to the disposition of certain property. But the nature of this matter was not recorded in any accessible public document. And then, in the 3rd paragraph, a single sentence that Marcus read 3 times. According to a notation in the county land use records from 1941, a portion of the rear acreage of the Correll property was subject to a use restriction of indeterminate nature, registered by a party whose name had been redacted from the available copies. And this restriction had been noted in the transfer documents when the land was sold for residential development in 1957, but had subsequently been omitted from the individual parcel deeds. Omitted, not removed, omitted. Marcus sat in the plastic chair with the county document in his hands and felt the architecture of the thing shift slightly, the way a building shifts when a load-bearing wall is found to be in a different place than the blueprints indicate. The restriction was real and recorded and then deliberately omitted from the paperwork when the land changed hands. Whoever had bought the Correll land in 1957 and divided it into residential lots had either not known about the restriction or had known about it and chosen not to pass it forward. The Bellamy family had bought the lot at Correll Lane in 1968. Raymond Bellamy had received no information about what lay at the back of his own property near the trees. Not until he dug deep enough to find it. Marcus drove back to the house in the rain. He parked in the driveway and sat for a moment watching the rain come down on the yard. He could see the back fence, collapsed in two places, and the fire pit and the beginning of the long grass that stretched to the tree line. He could not see the rectangular depression in the earth from here, but he knew its dimensions now from memory, for feet by 2 feet. Edges to define for erosion or animal activity, soil, at the bottom exposed recently. He thought about what made a depression that size. He thought about boxes of documents. He thought about 3 boxes in the back of a truck. He went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard in the rain, and he thought about his father's choice. Raymond had found a set of documents in 1993 that described an arrangement made in 1941 involving something that was to remain undisturbed for 50 years. By 1993, that 50 years was over. The arrangement, whatever it was, had expired. And Raymond, careful, methodical, deeply private Raymond Bellamy, who had spent 5 years trying to open a box and another 2 years reading what was inside it, had made a choice about what to do with that information. He had not gone to the authorities. He had not told his wife. He had not told anyone, apparently, except possibly a man named Harold who was now presumably dead. He had taken down the cold house. He had packed 3 boxes. And he had left. The question that Marcus had been circling for days now, the question that sat at the center of everything, was this: what had he taken with him in those boxes? And what had he left behind? Because something had been left behind. The coffee tin under the porch boards. The note and the photograph and the first key. Left in a hiding place on the property itself, not taken away. Left as though Raymond had wanted his son to find it, eventually. At the right time. When Raymond was no longer there to have to explain himself. Marcus picked up the 3rd key, the small dark one from the windowsill dish, and looked at it. He had been everywhere in this house. He had tried every lock. He had not yet, he realized, looked in the backyard itself, not for a lock. He had looked for the depression, for the carved numbers, for the evidence of recent digging. He had not looked at the fire pit. He put on his coat and went out into the rain. The fire pit was a circle of stones, 12 of them, each one roughly the size of a person's head, set into the earth, in a shallow ring with a diameter of about 4 feet. The stones had been there for years. The moss at their bases told him that, and the way the surrounding earth had grown up around them. In this center, the accumulated ash of a decade of fires had compacted into a layer that sat a few inches below the tops of the stones. Marcus had glanced at it on his first day and registered it as a fire pit and moved on. Now he crouched beside it in the rain and looked at it carefully. The stones were ordinary field stones, the kind you could pull from any Midwestern field. But one of them was not quite right. The stone directly opposite the house, the 12 o'clock position if you were standing at the back door looking toward the tree line, was slightly different in color from the others, a shade lighter, and its base did not have the same mossy growth. It had been placed more recently than the others. Marcus moved the stone aside with both hands. It was heavy and the rain made it slick, and it took 2 attempts, but it moved. Beneath it was not earth. It was a flat piece of slate, cut to fit precisely in the gap. And in the surface of the slate, set flush so that it was invisible unless you knew to look, was a small keyhole. Marcus held the 3rd key over the keyhole for a moment without inserting it. The rain came down on his back, and the water ran down the back of his neck, and he looked at the keyhole and thought about his father making a choice. He thought about the note that was not addressed to anyone. He thought about a man who leaves his family in the night and then spends 11 years alone in the house he left them in, keeping a fire pit over a locked slate in his backyard. He thought about what it means to leave something behind for your son to find. He thought about whether leaving something behind is the same as asking for forgiveness, or whether it is simply a different kind of departure. He put the key in the lock and turned it. Beneath the slate was a cylindrical space lined with what appeared to be lead sheeting, about 18 inches deep and roughly 10 inches in diameter. Inside the space, sealed in a modern zipper bag of the kind used for food storage, was a notebook. A standard composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover. And in Raymond's handwriting on the cover, one line, "For Marcus, when he is ready." Marcus took the notebook out of the rain. He sat on the back porch steps with it in his lap, under the porch overhang, and he opened it. It was 43 pages, written front to back in Raymond's careful hand. And it was the most complete document of a human reckoning that Marcus had ever read. It was not a confession in the legal sense. There was nothing in it that described a crime. Nothing that required the involvement of any authority. It was an account. It was Raymond Bellamy explaining, for the first time and the last time, what he had found in his backyard, and what he had done about it, and why he had done it in the way that he had. It was also, beginning on page 27 and continuing to the end, a letter to his son. Marcus read the notebook in one sitting, on the back porch in the rain. And by the time he reached the last page, the rain had stopped and the light had shifted to the thin, clear quality that arrives in the late afternoon of an October day when the storm has passed. The yard was wet and still. The tree line dripped. The fire pit sat open, the stone set aside, the slate lifted and the lead-line cylinder visible. What Raymond had found, the matter, as the 1941 documents called it, was a collection of materials, documents and objects that represented the record of something that had occurred on the Corel land in the years between approximately 1935 and 1941, a record kept by a family that had understood the weight of what they were preserving and had made a legal arrangement to protect it, not from destruction but from premature discovery. A 50-year arrangement. 50 years for the principles involved to be gone, for the heat of the thing too cool, for the world in which it had happened to recede far enough that the record could be received differently than it would have been at the time. Marcus could not summarize what the record contained, not even to himself. Not standing in the wet October yard with the notebook in his hands. It was the kind of document that resists summarizing, not because it is fragmentary or unclear, but because it is complete. In a way that completeness is sometimes devastating. It was the record of decisions made by ordinary people in desperate circumstances. And the consequences of those decisions, and the way those consequences had moved through time and property and family and arrived. Finally, in the backyard of a man named Raymond Bellamy, who had the misfortune and the particular character to be the kind of person who cannot find something buried in his own yard and simply leave it there. What Raymond had done with the record was this: he had read it. He had verified it to the degree that verification was possible through his own research over 5 years. He had made his own record, the pages Marcus had found upstairs in the manila folder. And then he had made a choice about what to do with the original materials. He could not destroy them. He had considered it and found he could not. He could not bring them to light in the way that the 1941 arrangement had imagined, because the world had changed in the 50 years of the arrangement in ways that made the conventional mechanisms of disclosure inadequate. So he had taken them away. He had put them somewhere safe, somewhere specific, somewhere that he described in the notebook with enough precision for Marcus to find. And then he had come back to the house. And he had stayed. He had stayed because, as the letter to his son in the last 16 pages made clear, Raymond Bellamy had understood that he had no right to make this decision alone. He had taken the materials because he could not leave them where anyone might find them. And he had stayed because he could not leave the question of what to do with them to chance. He had waited all those years for Marcus to grow up enough and come back. He had trusted, not known, but trusted that the house would eventually bring his son back. And he had left him 3 keys, and a note and a photograph because Raymond Bellamy did not know how to write a letter to his son directly. But he knew how to leave a trail. Marcus sat on the back steps with the notebook in the rain-wet afternoon and thought about his father sitting in this same house for 11 years. He thought about a man who could not explain himself directly, and so explained himself indirectly. Through objects and hiding places and the precise, maddening language of someone who trusts a trail more than a conversation. He thought about the fact that he was, in this moment, more his father's son than he had ever understood himself to be. He picked up his phone and called Dana. She answered on the first ring. He said, "I found it." She said, "What is it?" He said, "It's going to take a while to explain." She said, "Are you all right?" He thought about the question. He thought about the weight of the notebook in his hand and the open fire pit in the wet yard and the tree line going golden in the late afternoon light. He thought about a child's shoe in a glass jar and the word mistake written 3 times and a man backing out of a driveway without explanation. He thought about the last line of his father's letter, which read, "I am sorry for the way I left. I was not ready then." "I hope this is enough." Marcus said, "I think so. Yeah, I think I am." He sat on the back steps until the light went fully out of the sky. And then he went inside and turned on every light in the house. And for the first time since arriving on Corral Lane, the house felt different. Not empty. Not inhabited by a ghost of a life. Just a house, full of objects and years, and the ordinary sediment of a human being who had lived there. Badly and truly, and with a weight he had carried as best he could, which was not perfectly, which was not even close to perfectly, but which was Marcus could see now, reading backward through everything as well as he had known how. In the morning he would make calls. He would speak to a historian who specialized in county land records, whose name Raymond had provided in the notebook. He would speak to a lawyer who was not Gerald Pruitt. He would make arrangements for the materials that Raymond had left. Arrangements that honored the original intention of the 1941 record, which was not concealment but careful timing, not burial but preservation. He would bring Dana and Lily to Millhaven. He would show them the backyard. He would show Lily the oak tree and the carved numbers and explain what they meant in the careful, age-appropriate language of a father who wants his daughter to understand that history is not only in museums. But first, he sat in his father's kitchen with the notebook open on the table, and he read the letter again. All 16 pages. And at the end of the letter, in the last paragraph, Raymond had written something that Marcus had not quite processed the first time through, reading in the rain. He wrote, "I could not explain to you why I left, but I believe you will find, if you are the person I think you are, that everything I left behind will explain it better than I could have. The backyard was hell 3 times because I made it hell. I was trying to fix something. I did not fix it, but I left you the keys. What you do with them is yours." Marcus closed the notebook. He thought about 3 keys. He thought about what it means to leave a person the tools for a thing you could not finish yourself. He thought about the difference between abandonment and inheritance, and whether those 2 things are always as separate as we need them to be. He did not have an answer. But he had the notebook. He had the keys. He had his father's handwriting, careful and imperfect. Across 4 to 3 pages that had waited in a lead-lined cylinder under a fire pit for however many years. Raymond had known he was running out of time to wait. He had a backyard in Indiana and an oak tree with 2 years, carved into its bark and a rectangular depression in the earth that someone, and he now understood who, and why, had opened recently and then carefully closed again, a final act of maintenance on a property that was no longer his to maintain. Raymond had been there. In the last weeks of his life, Raymond had come back to the yard one more time. Marcus sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, in the lit-up house on Corral Lane, listening to the ordinary silence of a house at night. And he thought about everything his father had left him. Not the property, not the house, not the filing cabinet full of tax records. The real inheritance. 3 keys, and a note and a photograph, and 43 pages of a man trying, in the only language available to him, to say the thing he had never been able to say while there was still time to say it in person. The backyard was quiet. The fire pit sat open in the dark. The tree line held its secrets the way tree lines always do, completely, patiently, without judgment, and the oak with its carved numbers stood at the edge of the light from the kitchen window. 2 years, and everything in between, and Marcus looked out at it through the glass and thought, I hear you, Dad. I hear you now. If you watched this all the way through, it means this story reached you. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end so I can meet you and know who truly loves the stories here on this channel. If this story moved you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because some stories are too important to watch alone. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now. Because every week there is a new story waiting here that deserves to be found by the right person at exactly the right time.